You're listening to the London studios of The Voice of Russia. I'm Tim Ecott. An outbreak of the potentially fatal Ebola virus in West Africa is being described as out of control by the medical charity Medecins Sans Frontières. In the past 4 months, cases have spread from Guinea into Sierra Leone and Liberia, with around 400 people now thought to have been killed. Other charities and disease control specialists have warned that the countries affected do not have the facilities to control the spread of the disease, and in some areas to quarantine or control the movement of people who've been in contact with victims. The fact that Ebola kills up to 90% of those who contract it tends to grab people's attention and, of course, the media headlines. But some analysts and doctors argue that other health issues in Africa receive far less attention, and also that, serious though Ebola is, it can relatively be safely ignored, precisely because it tends to only affect some of the poorest parts of Africa. Well, to discuss the issues surrounding this current crisis, I'm joined on the telephone line by Dr. Ben Neuman, who's a virologist at the University of Reading's School of Biological Sciences. In the studio with me, I have the philosopher and writer, Dr. Mahlet Zimeta. She's an honorary research associate at the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. And also in the studio with me is Sulayman Jeng. He's the assistant editor of the Gambian newspaper Kibaaro News. And also joining us via Skype all the way from Liberia is the journalist and founder of the charity Straight from the Heart, Agnes Umunna. Welcome to you all. Let me start with Dr. Ben Neuman. You are a virologist. Just briefly, some people have described Ebola as dangerous as the Black Death. Just give us an idea in medical terms of why anyone should worry about this disease.
Well, on a case-by-case basis, this is one of the most deadly pathogens that we know about. In the current cases, it affects and actually kills somewhere between 50% and 90% of the people who are infected. However, the good side, the silver lining, if you like, is that the virus doesn't spread very well. When it does spread, it actually makes your body essentially attack itself. The white blood cells that would normally be cleaning up the virus infection are provoked into releasing a lot of harmful chemicals that sort of degrade the inner lining of your blood vessels. And this is what eventually causes death through organ failure.
What is the treatment? I mean, containment seems to be crucial, but is there a vaccine? What do they do in a hospital if you contract it?
In a hospital, as I understand it, the treatment is generally bed rest. You try and keep the patient well hydrated and comfortable for the duration of the virus, which can sometimes last as much as a month.
But no actual quick fix or cure, no drug that sorts it out?
No, in the laboratories, people have found some drugs that seem, at least in cell culture, in vitro tests, to be effective against the virus. But as far as I'm aware, these haven't been used in a clinical setting, and we don't know if the cost of these, the damage they would do to the people, would be better than the preferable to the disease at the moment.
Dr. Neuman there from the University of Reading School of Biological Sciences, you've explained there some of the biology behind this, but let me go now to Liberia and Agnes Umunna. Agnes, your country affected by it. We've heard the clinical case there, but are people worried about this current outbreak in your city?
I don't think people are worried about the outbreak of Ebola because there is no much awareness in Liberia. And people are running away from doctors. Some lock their doors because they are kind of rumors about how diseases are spreading. And I think there should be more sensitization on the Ebola sickness. People in Liberia think it's just like the WHO just want to get funding from donors. And more the government officials are not doing more sensitizations to educate people about it. And another question is, they don't have lab to test those that are dead from the diseases if it's real diseases from Ebola.
Agnes Umunna there in Liberia, do you believe that, for example, the Liberian government is not in a strong position when it comes to either public health education or indeed the facilities to stop people moving around?
It's not just Liberia. All countries affected should mobilize emergency response mechanism in cases to surveillance and call international community to mobilize resources. The government is not really doing much because if they are doing much, they should have sensitization And in Lofa County, they have new cases. We have 5 new cases reported, and 11 people died in Lofa. So how should the team go to Lofa County and they have been driven away? So the government have to do more education about it. I don't know how they are doing it.
Well, that's the view there from Agnes Umunna in Liberia. Sulayman Jeng here in London, but working with the Kibaaro News of Gambia. Gambia, I think, a little bit of a ray of hope there. WHO, the World Health Organization, I think, has put some hard effort into making sure that Gambia at least has some level of preparedness. Is that right?
Yeah, Gambia, it is very right, has a very level of preparedness for an outbreak of an Ebola. The Gambian government, through its Ministry of Health and Social Welfare, has set up preparatory mechanisms through its partners and stakeholders. And what they did, the government did in the first place, is when they heard about the outbreak in Guinea and in Liberia, they set up the border control mechanism. Flights from the affected areas were kind of banned. But at least what the government was able to achieve was to control people coming into the Gambia with the virus. And then planes were only allowed to drop people and not to pick anyone. The government also, did a nationwide assessment, of the resources that they have and materials on the ground and in the health facilities in case if there is, an Ebola, epidemic. The Gambian also government has initiated, a nationwide sensitization program, and then they have also created sub-regional, what they call technical advisory committees and local authorities on Ebola for each region.
So it sounds like they're making a lot of preparation there in Gambia. I'll quickly come back to Dr. Ben Neuman there as a virologist. We've heard that it's spread relatively small numbers, I suppose, in West Africa at the moment. Places like Gambia, public education and taking some steps to quarantine areas to stop the free movement of people. But why haven't we seen Ebola come to Europe?
What happens is, as the disease progresses, the person starts to feel worse and worse, and it's about the time the person starts to feel really bad that they're most likely to be able to transmit the disease. These people, they wouldn't want to move. From what I understand, you just want to lie down and be still during this time. So it may be that people are incapacitated enough that they don't spread it, but there's certainly no physical barrier to spreading the virus overseas by air travel.
Now, back to the studio, Dr. Mahlet Zimeta. You've written for the Royal African Society about the problem of Ebola and how you, I think, believe it's been rather ignored in terms of medical research. Do you think there's some kind of prejudice at work here in terms of how Africa is regarded and how serious a threat the disease might be?
Well, I don't know if I think that Ebola has been ignored in terms of medical research, but I think there are practical economic constraints that make it hard for African researchers to lead work in this area. So if you want to do research on Ebola, you need to be working in labs that have the highest level of biosafety level 4. And there are about 42 of these labs known to be in existence, and only 2 are in Africa. A lab like this costs about 2.5 million euros annually to maintain, and the physical security of it it's so. One researcher described it as a submarine inside a bank vault. So it's very restricted access, and so at the cost of creating and maintaining one of these labs mean that it's very difficult for African universities, African governments, researchers based in Africa to pioneer research in this field.
Dr. Ben Neuman, you're our science expert on this. Is there any point in pursuing that level of high-tech research in Africa on Ebola, or should the existing labs in Europe be doing it?
Africa is where the disease always comes back, and about every 2 years it seems to rear its ugly head again. So people in Africa have the vested interest. These are the people who are going to be infected, and these are the people, I would think, who would most want to do research. Yeah, it's really a shame that there aren't more Category 4, really high containment laboratories there to enable them to do this.
Agnes Umunna, you're there in Liberia, as we've said. Lots of pressing problems in countries like Liberia. Is that where money should be being spent, in your view, or are there other health issues which are far more damaging in terms of people's quality of life and persistent threat to their health?
Since the outbreak began, 24 people died in Liberia, 49 in Sierra Leone, and 264 in Guinea. And there is no lab to verify any of these dates. So I think the most important is for WHO to make a lab in Africa where they can verify if these deaths are caused by Ebola. And there are so many health issues that are affecting Africans, Liberians, and other people that comes in. Recently, a Canadian came from Liberia and he felt sick. People thought it was Ebola. So the most important thing is for us to talk about health issues, which is the most important thing. So my idea for people or for the WHO is for us to create a lab in Liberia. I mean, for us to get all these viruses to be transferred into Europe, it takes time. By the time the result come, 12 or 20 people are dead just to test this one. So I know there is no money, but the most priority things that the government president can do is to create these labs for us in Liberia or in Africa. We should have something in Africa, especially in West Africa where these viruses are being found now.
Perhaps it should be in Gambia, Sulayman Jeng. Is Gambia the kind of place where this could operate, or do you not think it's a priority?
No, it is, because the president is very much interested in this Ebola case. And recently he has bought, a very sophisticated machine that could test the virus, which costs about $50 million. So with the level of preparedness that the Gambia has in place, I think if there should be a laboratory in Africa, it should be in the Gambia.
Ebola, in many people's eyes, would seem like a low risk or a low priority in terms of the number of victims.
Yeah, I do agree with you on that level, but you also have to look at every country has its specific health issues. Like in the Gambia, we used to have malaria as a major killer disease, but of late it's like the government also, like the Ebola thing, has what we call the nets, and then this insecticide that they kind of sensitize the general public how to prevent, the malaria disease, protecting themselves from mosquito bites. Like they have these nets that they soak into some kind of insecticide that people use overnight. So it kind of reduces the amount of, or the level of infection. It's no longer a major killer disease in the Gambia. Like with the Ebola case, when they heard of the outbreak in Guinea, the government set up, a preparedness plan, which they put forward to their stakeholders and partners. And then recently, the WHO has donated, leaflets and other materials that would also help to enhance the sensitization of
Gambia, quite a small country, and communication within Gambia is much easier than it is in other parts of West Africa, though, isn't it? I mean, you're slightly lucky in that way.
No, it depends on the government's interests, because if you look at Africa, it's like most of the governments have more political priorities than other health social, or educational,
I understand.
facilities.
I mean, even when it comes to control movement of people from affected regions, there is no improved screening at checkpoints. People cross in borders from West Africa, especially Guinea and Sierra Leone, to Liberia. There is no screening checkpoints, and people just go in between these West African countries, and nobody is screened. Somebody will be sick from Guinea and come here. There is no screening points where people are being screened.
Agnes Umunna there in Liberia, do you think that external agencies are the people to look after this, or is it the individual African governments? You've mentioned Liberia and Sierra Leone, Guinea. The borders meet, very difficult to put restrictions on people's movement. Is there enough will and technical ability in the Liberian government's case, for example, to address the things you're worried about?
I think they should call on international community to mobilize resources. I think they can mobilize huge resources in West Africa to see how they can control movement and screening point, and I think international community with the WHO can do a lot to mobilize these things.
Mahlet Zimeta here in London. Do you think that Ebola attracts a bit too much attention because it's quite a dramatic disease, but actually in the African context, Westerners perhaps worry about it too much?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I think my concern is not that it's attracting too much attention, but maybe it's attracting the wrong kind of attention.
It's very exciting, though, isn't it? It's a sort of Hollywood horror scenario, isn't it? The idea that there's this virtually instant death available from this exotic,
gruesome.
Gruesome death that will come from Africa if we're not careful. Let's worry about what happens if it escapes from Africa.
Yes, so I think there's at least two different things going on there. And one is there's this phrase, disaster pornography, where we have a kind of almost pornographic attention is paid to catastrophes, calamities, disasters, earthquakes. It's visually shocking and it's spectacular. It's understandable that it attracts immediate attention, but it's the consequence of this kind of pornography worrying, because it rewards a kind of short-term attention and not a kind of meaningful, long-term informed engagement.
Do you worry, though, specifically about the fact that Ebola is seen as an African virus?
Well, there is sort of colonial fantasies going on there. But generally, in terms of how illness is understood, Susan Sontag, the philosopher and writer, has done some really interesting work on how illness is understood. And when we don't have a cure for an illness, it kind of becomes a location of our fantasy. So in the 19th century, it was tuberculosis. We didn't know what was caused it. We didn't know how to cure it. So it kind of became this romantic and deadly illness, and people maybe had it as a moral judgment on themselves, and and it was taboo. You couldn't talk about it, and if you had it, you were socially shunned. And then it moved to AIDS, to HIV. That's the plague. If you've got it, you have to keep it quiet. Ebola, because we don't yet have a cure for it, it's taking that place of and I'm a bit concerned at the policies of containment that are being followed, because that's not the World Health Organization recommendation. They said, in fact, containment is not needed. As far as I understand...
But they themselves, though, have people working in Africa who've told this programme that they do want to stop people moving about if they've been exposed to infection.
But only because there's been a problem in communication. As far as I understand, Ebola is transmitted by bodily fluids. It's not an airborne virus. So it can't be transmitted by travel, by trade, by closing the borders.
I think the reason for the containment of travel is mainly because, like you stated, there is no proper understanding of the disease itself. How to identify it, and the proper labs wherein you can test, to confirm that X or Y has contracted the disease, or, how it is, we understand it's transmitted through body fluid.
Agnes Umunna there, you were trying to break in there. Do you accept there what Dr. Zimeta was saying about, to an extent, people getting overexcited about this because it's a slightly glamorous disease to those who are not exposed to it, at least?
My strong belief is the international community have to collaborate with the Ministry of Health in their countries and to address three key areas: education, communication, behavior change, and surveillance in terms of tracking contact with suspected cases. And I think it has to come from the Ministry of Education to stand firm to WHO and USAID how to go about it and to reach the communities. Let
me talk to Dr. Ben Neuman here in the University of Reading School of Biological Sciences. As a virologist, do you recognize that picture that Mahlet Zimeta was painting there, of this being almost a romantic disease like tuberculosis, something to be feared because it is gruesome?
I see that all around me, absolutely. But I don't think that's the reason why we should go after this virus and try to stop it. I think the reason is that this is a very controllable and very potentially curable problem. You've got a virus that's always probably going to be in a band that runs right through the middle of Africa, so it's going to keep coming back. But each time it comes into people, it burns itself out in a few months. Other studies have shown that you only need to control a little bit of the virus, maybe knock back 90% of the virus with a drug or something, and a person can potentially survive.
So who's going to put the money and time into doing that?
Well, lots of small labs around the world are already putting their money and time into sort of coming up with possible solutions. And there's a wide range of these, things from antibodies, little proteins, lots of different drugs that seem to be at least promising. It's just that the next step, getting it to something that we know is safe to use and effective in the clinic, this is very, very expensive. And frankly, I'm not sure whether individual countries can afford this or would have a reasonable vested interest in putting up that kind of money. And I think it's a much easier problem to solve than HIV, which once you have it, it's yours forever. Cancer, it's basically a mutation of you. It's almost too much life. Or even something like tuberculosis, which hides inside of our cells and is very difficult to root out. Yeah, Ebola can be fixed.
That's encouraging, Dr. Zimeta, here in London. Philosophically, does that reassure you on any level?
I thought what Dr. Neuman said was very interesting, and it was new to me.
It sounds like there is the scientific will, but the big question he didn't answer was how much would it cost?
Yeah, so he said that it may not be affordable to individual countries. And if that's right, it might mean that the Ebola virus recurs and recurs and recurs in Africa. And what would be a shame is if each time we got this kind of hysterical media frenzy and this fantasy of Africa, the dark continent from which death is going to come.
Do you recognise that picture, Agnes Umunna, in Liberia? Do you feel somehow victimised when Ebola is referred to as an African virus? Does that matter that it comes from Africa?
It matters to me because like HIV/AIDS, he said it came from Africa because of monkeys. So why should Ebola be an African disease? Look, the guy that came from Liberia to Canada, as soon as he came, he was treated. And I think they suspected it was Ebola, but because there are treatments and health services there, he was treated. But if somebody is suspected of Ebola in Liberia, there is no place to diagnose it. So how is it going to be? So it's not an African disease. It's just that they just want to stick it to Africa and they can't find a way to find labs to verify if these are Ebola diseases. My problem with the African countries or international communities, it does not cost to have a small lab. Like I'm looking for a small lab to diagnose sexual transmitted disease. I can't afford it. Even when you go to international communities, you say, can you just set this out up? But they don't want to do it. All what they want to do, they come and tell you what they want to do in your countries. They have people in Africa that have good ideas. Why can't they sit down and talk to them? A small lab does not cost anything. Let's start from setting up labs in Africa.
Sulayman Jeng, you're an African journalist, writing about all kinds of different topics. Do you recognise anything in what Agnes Umunna is saying there? Do you think we still have this habit of, in the West or in Europe, of putting Africa in a box and saying, if it's African and it's a disease, it must be particularly dangerous and we should be afraid of it?
Yeah, it is a two-way. The West stereotype Africans, and Africans also always rely on the West to resolve their problems for them. Personally, I think Africans should step up and own up to some of their problems and try to resolve them without relying much on external forces or agents like the Western world.
But it all comes back to money, doesn't it? Africa, like it or not, is poorer than Europe.
Well, it depends on how you define poverty. When it comes to resources, Africa has more resources than Europe. Europe rely a lot on Africa for their raw materials to develop themselves. So if Africans step up and become more responsible, they can at least harness the resources they've got to develop themselves instead of relying on the West to do it all for them. Let's say in the case of the Gambia, for example, if the government was complacent, they would not have done any national assessment of the facilities they have. They would not have come up with any plan to kind of prepare the state in case of an epidemic. They would not sensitize the public, but the public is aware. Like earlier you did mention, because Gambia is a small state, so it's easier to communicate, which I said it depends. If the government is not interested in educating the people, they will not be educated.
What do you make of that, Agnes Umunna? Do you see what Sulayman Jeng is saying?
Yeah, because, Africa, we have to own up for ourselves. If you try to do something, then people from America or Europe can now try to say, okay, she's doing this or he is doing this, we can do it. Gambia is doing a great work. The government have to be interested in people's health. Then the international community will join in to see what they can do. You have to be interested in your own community or your own people. Exactly what he's saying is right. We have to own up of what we are doing in Africa to improve our health issues.
Dr. Neuman, again, as a virologist, presumably you would see science and your branch of it, virology, as colourblind, nation blind. You're looking at an organism. You don't care, presumably, where it comes from. But the money has to presumably come from somewhere. Do you see it as a two-way traffic in terms of research that goes and comes back and forth from Africa or not?
I suppose that's the problem. I may not care where a particular virus comes from. I'm interested in the virus, but my funding body probably does. If it's a UK funding body, they're only going to want to fund things that affect a UK interest. Yeah.
Dr. Zimeta here again from UCL. You do research there, but you've written a lot about the philosophy of these kinds of things. Do you accept what Sulayman Jeng has been saying, that actually Africa needs to step up a little bit more to address some of these problems?
I agree with him when he says that that actually, how you define poverty is crucial, and Africa is not poor in resources, nor in will or energy. It's only economically poor, but it's about marshalling those resources. I think that we mustn't forget, though, the history of divide and rule and exploitation. So I'm a bit wary when we seem to portray African governments as intrinsically incompetent and malicious, and forget the conditions under which they're operating, which are exploitative, and the conditions, the various kind of agreements, international agreements that they are held to by other parties.
But how does that specifically affect healthcare?
So let's think about biodiversity. There's this thing called the Nagoya Protocol. So to follow up on Dr. Neuman's point about funding for certain kinds of research. So the Nagoya Protocol was set up to protect biodiversity and ensure that the benefits of this kind of research were shared internationally and equally. So the idea being that would motivate kind of indigenous peoples in rural areas to cooperate with kind of, say, the big pharmaceuticals, or with governments of other countries or international organisations.
In case there were natural resources
Exactly.
there that could be exploited and
Exactly.
developed to provide a cure for certain diseases.
Exactly. And actual agreement to the protocol has been widely spread in the so-called developing world and very minimally taken up in the developed world. They're not interested in equal sharing of resources or mutual benefit. And we have, I think it was Indonesia, I'd have to check, I'm not sure, but a country in Southeast Asia actually refused to hand over samples of the most recent version of the, I think, bird flu to the World Health Organization, because it was trying to sign an agreement with a drug company to develop a vaccine or a cure suitable for its own population. Because if they hand it over to the World Health Organization and an international kind of cure is developed, they're not going to be the first country that gets it, and they may not be able to afford it. So I think, we're seeing interesting reactions from countries in the so-called developing world. And there's a reason for this, and we mustn't forget the history of exploitation, and it's a current history. It hasn't been addressed.
Dr. Neuman, is there such a thing as a ballpark figure for how much it costs to develop a drug that might fight Ebola?
I think the numbers, the main cost is in people, as I suppose every aspect of research is. Somewhere around 100 million to 200 million would be the low end, and it can go a little higher than that.
Dollars.
But it's the cost of dollars. Getting it's the cost of getting doctors to the right place, renting hospitals, putting all that equipment there, manufacturing the drug, making a factory to manufacture the drug. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, more than just handing the person a pill and seeing if it works.
Agnes Umunna there in Liberia, is $100 million, is that a fair price to defeat Ebola?
I don't know how to calculate these things, but in West Africa, there is a weak public centers for people, and more have to be done to prevent Ebola spread in the communities. But as I said, my president is an Iron Lady in Liberia, the first African president in Liberia. She can come up with international women and say, I need an Ebola lab in Liberia, and she can get it. I know how strong she is, she can get it. But when it comes to money, people can raise money. I know how much money she has raised for election and for campaign. I know she can raise that to get a lab in Liberia just for Ebola.
That's encouraging news, Agnes Umunna there, founder of Straight from the Heart charity and radio presenter. Thank you very much for joining us from Liberia. Last word to you, Mahlet Zimeta. $100 million to all of us, I assume, around the table sounds like a lot of money, but I suppose for 50-odd countries in Africa, if they pooled together, that would be affordable. Is it where that sort of money should be spent?
I'm not sure that's for me to say, because it's the wider context. Because I think that if a government spent that money on an Ebola cure, then they might be criticised for not spending it on education or on famine, malnutrition, that kind of thing, or sexual health. So I think in the context of of all the other problems the government has to deal with, I can't say. But I think back to the earlier point about disaster pornography, I think what would be good is if the attitude towards the victims was closer to compassion rather than awe and spectation, just kind of watching. It'd be nicer if the attitude towards the victims was closer to empathy and compassion rather than seeing them as a kind of spectacular suffering.
All right. Well, indeed, a good point to end on. Dr. Mahlet Zimeta, Honorary Research Associate at the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Thank you very much for joining us here in the studios of the Voice of Russia. Thank you, too, to the Assistant Editor from the Kibaaro News of Gambia, Sulayman Jeng, and again on the phone from Liberia, Agnes Umunna, and on the telephone from the University of Reading's School of Biological Sciences, the virologist Dr. Ben Neuman. I'm Tim Ecott. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia, coming to you from the London studios.